Now, let's look at some different kinds of evidence and evaluate its quality. Generally, there are two kinds of evidence, direct and circumstantial. Direct evidence supports an assertion without inference. Circumstantial evidence supports it with inference. Inference means the evidence suggests something. Circumstantial evidence may have an alternative explanation. Consider the following scenario. John, Peter, Paul, Mark, and Matthew are in front of a judge accusing Luke of being a shoplifter. John says, "When I look at Luke, I see a shoplifter." Peter says, "I wonder what Luke lifted from the shop." Paul says, "I saw Luke put something in his pocket." Mark says, "Paul told me he saw Luke put something in his pocket." Matthew says, "I have a security video showing Luke shoplifting." Let's ponder these responses in a little more detail. First, John's statement is an opinion and can be rejected right out of hand. An opinion is not evidence. While an expert opinion can be helpful in explaining complicated issues, the opinion rendered by John is irrelevant, regardless of whether or not Luke is a shoplifter. It is just an opinion. Second, Peter's statement is speculation. It too is not evidence. It is a conjecture, in other words, an assumption. It assumes Luke is a shoplifter, but he may not be. Any judge worth his salt would reject it immediately. Third, Paul's eyewitness account is not trustworthy as evidence because he may dislike Luke and simply lie to get him in trouble, or he might somehow benefit from his detention. That possibility prevents it from being reliable. Fourth, Mark's statement is hearsay and is not evidence, not to mention never admissible in respectable courts. Another word for hearsay is rumor. Imagine someone finding you guilty of a crime on the basis of a rumor. Finally, Matthew's statement, if true, is the only evidence worthy of consideration. Provided the footage has not been tampered with, it can be considered to display a real event taking place, a fact. It is the only contribution that can be considered direct and indisputable evidence. With these definitions in mind, it is now easy to address why eyewitness accounts or books do not constitute acceptable evidence. Eyewitness accounts are notoriously unreliable and are negatively affected by the psychological state of the subject. Not to mention, people simply lie when it suits them. A politician lying to maintain power over his constituents is no more common than a member of the clergy lying to maintain power over his congregation and profit from their psychological vulnerabilities. Both know they only need to say things that people desperately want to hear.
Live debt-free with the Miracle Spring Water and the Anointed Faith Tool.
The primary difference is that clergy has managed to condition people into thinking they are somehow immune from lying. But they are not.
Algunos teólogos y científicos modernos han tratado de despojar a Dios de su calor, de su afecto personal por la humanidad y su simpatía por sus criaturas, especialmente del hombre, que es la perfecta creación de Dios.
Every week, tens of thousands of priests, rabbis, and imams will stand in front of their congregations and dish out misinformation and lies about science. It is no excuse that clergy doesn't know any better. A lie propagated as truth is still a lie, and this makes the participating clergy immoral. A book is no different from a person describing an event. The only difference is that the description is expressed through text rather than speech. It is really another form of hearsay. The fact that hearsay may contain an element of truth makes no difference. A popular fiction like Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code contains multiple references to real places, real people, and real events, but the story is still fiction.
Now, as I told you yesterday, Darwin's theory tells us that man evolved from a lower order of animals.
Although what constitutes evidence is generally well known among scientists and trial lawyers alike, the same cannot be said of lay people. Most display profound ignorance of both the scientific method and evidence, although few, like the person of faith. As an example, religious people often point to their holy books as evidence when trying to convince others their faith is the only true one. Such arguments are simultaneously shallow, emotional, and irrational. The argument can simply be summarized as the rant, "My holy book is true because I believe it is." We should all realize that practically anybody can write a book, and in it claim the writing to be divine. The Quran, Bible, and Torah are all examples of such books. The fact that someone insists these books are special does not make them so. This is just their opinion, and it is not a law of nature that you have to respect these books at all. Respect should be earned and not assumed. Every holy book ever written has claimed divinity. Paul the Apostle, Muhammad, Joseph Smith, and L. Ron Hubbard all claimed this for the writing attributed to them. Suppose I write a book and claim its content was revealed to me by an archangel from God. Will you believe me? If I told you in earnest, the Holy Spirit spoke to me and channeled these words through me, would this help you secure sufficient faith? No, not quite. In modern times, most reasonable people acknowledge that someone uttering such words is either lying outright, lying to manipulate people, lying by a delusion of grandeur, or simply suffers from a mental illness like schizophrenia. No rational person would take such a statement seriously. According to a study by the National Alliance of Mental Illnesses from 2008, some 2 million Americans suffer from schizophrenia. This means that about 1 out of every 150 people suffer from this particular illness. It is a reasonable assumption that the frequency of mental illnesses has remained somewhat constant over the millennia. With that in mind, what do you think is a plausible explanation for a person, past and present, who claims his writing to be divine? 1. The person is lying outright. 2. The person is lying to manipulate people. 3. The person is lying by a delusion of grandeur. 4. The person suffers from a mental illness like schizophrenia. 5. A combination of 1 through 4. 6. The person is telling the truth. Mr. Bob Dutko is well known in Christian circles as a devout apologist whose resume features multiple appearances on Christian TV and talk radio. His argument for why Christianity is the only true religion fits this discussion perfectly. Mr. Dutko maintains a website that features arguments intended to convince us this claim has merit. His argument can be obtained in transcripts on his website. First, he acknowledges the following. All religions claim they are the one true faith, and certainly Christianity is no different in that it also claims to be the one true faith. So how can we know who is right? First, we have to understand and accept the fact that they cannot all be right, because they contradict each other. A few sentences later, he continues with this. If we are to approach this logically, we need to see that all religions began with a founder who had a philosophy, and then convinced others to follow that philosophy. So far, it is hard to disagree with Bob until he follows up with this convoluted concoction of something. The next logical step is to determine which of these religious leaders was speaking with the authority of heaven, the authority of God, the real God, the God who created the universe. So let's examine the facts. Jesus is the only religious leader who actually claimed to be God on earth in the flesh. Of course, he was the Son of God while in human flesh, and yet also fully God and fully human. While our finite minds are not yet capable of comprehending how the Son of God can also be fully God and fully human, we must acknowledge the fact that Jesus himself claimed this to be true, whether we can comprehend this mystery or not. So this is why Christianity is the only true religion, because Jesus said he was the Son of God. That's it? It is the vapor-like rigidity of such arguments that often spurs personal attacks on people of faith, as they expose a lack of logical aptitude. It is amazing its proponent wouldn't think long enough about it to realize its obvious logical shortcomings, in particular considering how frivolously the word logic is tossed around. Logical fallacy number 1 is a flawed premise. The premise is presumed to be factual, but this requires observable physical evidence, of which there is none because it is really based on faith. There simply is no evidence to support there is a God or heaven in the first place. In light of that, phrasing everything in the paragraph as if this were established beyond reasonable doubt is logically misleading. Logical fallacy 2 is universal applicability. The reasoning can be applied to all religions. This violates the premise that it is only applicable to Christianity. For instance, using this logic, the following claims can also be made. Hinduism is the only true religion because it's the only one to say everything is God. Islam is the only true religion because it most forcefully talks about submission to God. Or Buddhism is the only true religion because it is the only one to talk about the Four Noble Truths. And if you are a Pastafarian, you are in luck, for yours is the only religion that allows you to consume your God in the form of spaghetti bolognese with
some fava beans and a nice Chianti.
How can you beat that? In short, I only have to find something unique about my religion and point this out as the reason why it is the only true religion. All religions can do that. All in all, this is a juvenile competition in my daddy is stronger than yours. Logical fallacy 3 is another flawed premise. A statement of hearsay may or may not be true. Therefore, hearsay cannot be used to establish truth. Truth can only be established by irrefutable evidence. Hearsay is refutable because it can also be false. A book is a form of hearsay. Just because a claim is made in a book, any book, this is not sufficient to make it true. And whether or not Mr. Dutko, or for that matter the entire population of the planet, believes it to be true, is altogether irrelevant. If every person on the planet believed the Earth to be flat, would it be flat? The truth is not determined by what is popular. Logical fallacy 4. False alternatives. If religions cannot all be right, like Mr. Dutko states, they can certainly all be wrong. However, this option is left out of the discussion, and I suspect it is not for a lack of imagination. Another example of this profound ignorance is when adherents of the creationist religion refute the evidence for evolution with statements like, "Well, how can you say the fossils prove evolution? Were you there?" That is a stunning example of ignorance of the nature of evidence. Although the fossil evidence is inherently circumstantial, this in no way diminishes its value. To better understand this, consider a murder investigation. The dead body is evidence to an event having taken place, a murder. In the surrounding area we may find other evidence, broken furniture, empty cartridges, hair, and once assembled into a plausible hypothesis, will shed light on the whys and hows of the murder and its perpetrator. Does the fact that you were not there mean that the murder did not take place? Even if this were a valid argument, it would also apply to creationism and all religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam alike, since these are based on events that no one alive today witnessed either. In 1912, a British amateur archaeologist by the name of Charles Dawson claimed he found the fossilized remains of a hitherto unknown creature at an archaeological site near the village of Piltdown in East Sussex, England. It was claimed this creature, later called the Piltdown Man, was the missing link between humans and apes. At the time, it was hailed as one of the most important archaeological findings ever to surface in the history of the discipline. However, the Piltdown Man remained a topic of great controversy among scientists up until 1953, when it was conclusively demonstrated it was fake. In 1951, the famed humanist and anthropologist Ashley Montagu concluded in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, "The difference in massiveness between the Piltdown mandible and the Piltdown cranial bones being so great, it is suggested that on these grounds alone the mandible most probably does not belong with the cranium. Together with a great number of other anthropoid traits characterizing the mandible, it is suggested that the disharmony between the latter and the cranium is too great for these to belong to a single individual." The Piltdown Man was nothing more than the lower jawbone of an orangutan deliberately combined with the skull of a modern human. This is now recognized by many as the most significant hoax in the history of science. Once the Piltdown Man was identified as fraud, a considerable amount of self-reflection was in order, in particular for those scientists who had been duped. How could this happen? Wasn't there supposed to be a system of peer review to prevent such deceptions from taking place? Well, as so often, there is not a single explanation, but a combination of factors. The late biologist Stephen Jay Gould suggested a part wishful thinking and part cultural bias. The prevailing attitude at the time held it was the size of the brain that made humans different from other animals. This view contended that a large brain preceded other human characteristics on the evolutionary path. It has since been rejected. The evidence collected to date shows a gradual progression from small-brained but upright hominids to large-brained upright humans. Other reasons as to why the hoax was not identified earlier include that scientists weren't allowed to review the original evidence, which was securely locked up in the British Museum. Instead, they could only examine a model made from plaster, but this prevented important details from being investigated. Another reason cited is a human trait, naivete. The scientists simply did not expect someone would maliciously and intentionally deceive them. Before we judge, it is prudent we ask ourselves, who of us has never been deceived? Ultimately, the hoax exposes the fallibility of scientific knowledge. It crystallizes why it is so important to abandon the notion of absolute truth. We must recognize that while the scientific method is the best tool we have to collect useful knowledge, we, humans, are also its weakest link. This is analogous to a car being the best tool available to travel from point A to point B on land. It is always possible the driver takes the long way and hits potholes en route, but eventually we arrive at our destination. The hoax is an example of science treading down the wrong path, but it is also an example of science correcting the heading and putting us back on the right track. Only science could have righted that wrong, and this is something religion can learn from science: intellectual humility. Had the Piltdown man been an icon of faith, it is almost certain it would still be. Now let's look at a comparable predicament from religion and evaluate how the faithful handle such situations. The Shroud of Turin immediately comes to mind and remains an excellent illustration of the difference between the two thinking processes. The shroud is best known for a faint pattern that appears to be that of a long-haired, bearded man bearing an interesting resemblance to the Caucasian version of Jesus. The faithful claim this piece of cloth was used to cover his body after the crucifixion, and that it is his image that is seared into the cloth. The existence of the shroud is first mentioned in 1390 in the Common Era, when Bishop Pierre d'Arcy wrote a memorandum to anti-Pope Clement VII, stating the shroud was a fraud, and its maker had confessed. However, this has not stifled enthusiastic believers, and they maintain it is authentic. One way of determining the shroud's authenticity is to determine its age. This can be achieved using a standard C14 radiocarbon dating. If the shroud was shown to be some 2,000 years old, the believer's case would be bolstered, even though this would by no means mean the fabric covered Jesus, or any other person for that matter, as it remains very likely the pattern was simply painted. It could still be a fake from the 1st century. On the other hand, if younger than 2,000 years, the cloth would clearly be a fake. In 1988, in a move that even the most militant atheist must admit is admirable, the Vatican allowed radiocarbon estimation to be applied to the shroud. Initially, the intent was to have around 10 separate laboratories evaluate its age independently of each other. Eventually, only 3 were chosen. These were laboratories operated by Oxford University, the University of Arizona, and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. The intent was for each lab to date the specimen in secrecy, and then the results would be revealed in a press conference. On October 13, 1988, the results were announced by the Archbishop of Turin, Cardinal Anastasio Balestrero, in a well-attended press conference. The results were unequivocal. All 3 labs determined the age of the specimen to be some 646 to to 750 years old with 95% confidence. It appeared to have been fabricated sometime between 1208 and 1373 in the Common Era, considering the range of the results. And no, 95% confidence does not mean 5% chance the shroud is from the 1st century, but simply that if measured 100 times, 95 measurements would fall within the interval shown, and 2 to 3 on either side. Some claim the shroud is an artifact of mass-produced religious forgery sold as souvenirs to credulous medieval Christians during the Crusades, which lasted from 1095 to 1291 in the Common Era. The modern man is generally ignorant of the trades that were booming at the time and were directly caused by mass transportation of armies, animals, weapons, and even the entire families of the Crusaders. Many families intended to permanently live in the Holy Land. The soldiers were very wealthy men and traveled with servants, squires, and family members in groups easily exceeding 100,000 people. Buying horses, armor, weapons, and servants was definitely not for the poor. Making and selling religious souvenirs to the travelers was a lucrative business opportunity. Business people at the time were no less imaginative about what would sell well than they are in modern times. Most likely the shroud was born in such an environment. Little did the artist realize his work would unleash such confusion and denial among the masses. Upon the announcement, rather than dismissing the shroud like the scientists did the Piltdown hoax, the faithful began a desperate fight to reject the findings. The attacks were generally three-pronged and based on the following claims. First, the fabric had its radiocarbon elevated by bacterial contamination. Second, the fabric had its radiocarbon elevated after having been soaked in a carbon-rich environment during an alleged medieval fire. And third, the patch provided to the researchers belonged to a repair dating back to the 1300s. According to an anonymous source among the researchers contacted in preparation of this documentary, the first claim is simply false. Bacterial contamination will not affect the age indicated by the radiocarbon dating. The second claim, even if true, might shift the age of the shroud by some 100 years, at best. That is, it would indicate the shroud was woven in 1250 rather than 1350 in the Common Era. The third claim has been shown to be false. The original patch selected was a good representative for the shroud and was specifically selected as such. Claiming otherwise is a feeble grasp at straws. Since the radiocarbon dating rejects the hypothesis the shroud dates back to the 1st century, shroud fanatics will tell you the results are false. Of course, had the radiocarbon dating resulted in a 2,000-year-old shroud, the shroud fanatics would tell you it was highly reliable. But we have all come to expect that. After all, that is how the religious mindset works. The shroud has become a tourist trade, and it is imperative to pretend it is mysterious, as only this will guarantee the credulous continue to buy psychological therapy in the form of souvenirs and pilgrimage. It is ironic that the shroud, whose origin is most likely to be found in a profitable medieval tourist trade, to this day continues to churn out gold in this fashion. But as long as it does, the shroud fanatics will reject the scientific evidence. They are not about to let something as trivial as the truth get in the way of a profitable idea. In general, scientists are modest about their findings. When their findings are questioned, it is better to repeat the experiment than to persist in denial. They recognize there is always a chance that in spite of their best efforts, they may be wrong. It was under such concerns that in 2008, the original radiocarbon test was thoroughly reviewed by experts at Oxford University. This time around, the results were made public with much less fanfare. This review showed the 1988 results were indeed accurate. The shroud is now considered fraud among all serious scientists. The person on the cloth is religion's Piltdown man. You should be aware that a considerable amount of misinformation abounds on the World Wide Web. In particular, hypotheses that are part scientific and part wishful thinking. Enthusiasts will tell you the radiocarbon dating is off because of this, that, or the other thing. But they will not tell you that even if they were correct, the dating would only shift by a few years. There is no way it would shift by 13 centuries. By omitting such detail, they mislead laypeople on purpose. It simply appears to be about finding facts to support a desired conclusion. While all the most important details about the shroud have been cited here, a lot more exists, although none of it changes the conclusion. The shroud is a fake. Always do your own research, and don't trust those who have a stake in the outcome. Science has no stake in the outcome. Christianity does. In light of the success of science, it is not surprising that people try to associate their favorite activity with it. It is very popular among lay people to refer to such non-scientific activities as science. Any non-scientific activity claimed to be scientific is called a pseudoscience. Such activities are very common, and they are not all directly related to religion. Some have to do with astronomy, others with psychology and medicine and so on. The list you see scrolling contains examples of well-known pseudoscientific activities. There are typically two kinds of people who call such activities science. The first are people whose understanding of science is very limited and thus erroneously think, as long as some kind of knowledge is being collected, it must be science. The second group is what I call parasitic freeloaders. These are people who try to bring perception of scientific seriousness to their activity by associating it with science. This way they reap the benefit of the respect shown to scientific knowledge, without ever contributing anything useful to it. Parasitic freeloaders typically use some kind of scientific or techno-jargon or tools that are inherently scientific, such as computers, and pretend their activity is scientific. Some prepare astrological charts using computers, while others put on white lab coats before attempting telepathy. People will talk about energy fields or dynamic forces in the body or the flow of something, for instance ki. All of this sounds scientific, but when asked to define these terms, one discovers these are not reality-based concepts, but imaginary ones. These are people who do not realize that in order for an activity to be dignified as science, it better adhere to its rules. These require the activity to be observable, repeatable, and falsifiable. Yet when asked what makes their activity scientific, these three are not mentioned by the adherents, because they are simply unaware of them. One thing is common to all of these activities. a lack of evidence. All are just another kind of religion. Of course, the adherents claim the activity surely works. However, only a handful is as effective as placebo. Most are not even that. Placebo convinces the uncritical adherent and hardens the militant promoter. When placebo effect is suggested as an explanation, some become enraged and hostile, rather than simply showing actual evidence. How dare you question the activity? Such reactions show the harmful effects irrational ideas have on the human brain. One minute a person is pleasant and calm, but the next is taken by uncontrollable rage and aggression because their idea has been questioned. It is a strange reaction indeed that the less evidence there is to support an idea, the more defensive and aggressive the believer tends to get. Scientific creationism is probably one of the best known of the parasitic freeloaders. The term scientific creationism is an oxymoron. There is nothing scientific about creationism. It is a religion. Real science has already taken a look at its hypotheses and rejected them because they both lack convincing evidence and are supernatural. The religion of creationism does not produce scientific papers. Its members do not participate in scientific conferences, and most of its hypotheses are not even falsifiable. An example is the following supernatural hypothesis. The universe was created by an intelligent being, namely the Judeo-Christian God. This is not science, but religion. The proponents of creationism know that a large number of adherents can be attracted by pretending the activity is scientific. They are two-faced about science. They dismiss it when it rejects their hypotheses, but hail it when they think it supports their ideas. One of the primary goals of creationism and its baby brother, intelligent design, is to fight Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. Creationists think that if they can show evolution to be wrong, then creationism must be correct. Right? This is a fallacy of false alternatives in action. What they don't realize is that if evolution were shown to be false, it would be superseded by a third option, an improved theory of evolution, and not creationism. Even under such bizarre circumstances, creationism would still not be capable of answering the questions it currently can't, but evolution can. Creationism is the false alternative. It is a God did it explanation that doesn't explain anything.
IRS debt cancel. You got a check for how much? $28,000. Make the decision today to be financially free. Call the number on your screen and ask for the miracle spring water and the anointed faith tools. It will be the most important step you take. Live debt-free with the...
The world in which we live makes it impossible to know whom to trust. Sadly, many people are driven by avarice and self-indulgence, drives frequently so commanding that many mercilessly deceive and scam others for financial profits.
It's amazing. Cursed! I'm blessed!
Unscrupulous con artists abound who excel at misleading and defrauding people. Their work is made much easier by those who believe almost anything they're told and never seem troubled by a lack of evidence.
And God's going to give you an instant victory today. As they sing, will you come?
Such people are particularly vulnerable to charlatans, crackpots, and superstition. Oddly, some societies allow deception and lies on TV in the form of tele-evangelism, which has taken fraudulence and dishonesty to a new level. It seems mind-boggling that a society would unpityingly send pickpockets and shoplifters to prison, but these heralds of faith-filching can spew their vile swill of baseless nonsense over the air, without any consequences. Aside from placing a band-aid on someone's finger, no televangelist has ever healed anyone, nor spurred a single financial miracle. Ever. If they had, science would be over them like a pit bull on a poodle. But we all know there is no science in televangelism. It is a wretched form of thievery. One such fraudster is Robert Tilton, exposed in 1991 by ABC's Primetime Live television show. According to multiple lawsuits subsequently thrown his way, Mr. Tilton promptly removed money from tens of thousands of prayer request letters sent to him by his financially strained, spiritually starved, and logically challenged viewers before throwing them unread into the trash. Mr. Tilton's unscrupulous scamming program involved the preposterous act of talking to God.
The day is just one of those special kabaso donda. Masindi itoma kobosota bakasanda boko. Labako sodo bakadinde de boko sodo boko.
Something even a blindfolded half-wit would have seen through. He took the term "there is a sucker born every day" to its extreme, and became one of the wealthiest scammers in history until his empire of lies and deceit came tumbling down like a house of cards. One of Mr. Tilton's scams was to sell water marketed as holy to his emotionally absorbed and logically hollow viewers. This gimmick has been adapted by another scammer, Peter Popov, who is well known for his past frauds of pretend healing and faith-filching and subsequent bankruptcy in 1987, but has since then returned to late-night infomercials with his latest scam of miracle water and supernatural debt elimination.
Well, Liz, I've never seen God do so many miracles. Divine transfers, and it's just happening. It seems like Birmingham, Alabama is getting a special outpouring of divine blessings. It's amazing.
Told me that all my debt would be paid and then I would be going into another business. Well, I got a credit line of $100,000. I bought 3 houses I'm going to closing on. I am now a real estate investor. I have started a jewelry business on eBay. Amen.
Mr. Tilton is also back, like a persistent case of hemorrhoids. Of course, it doesn't have to be stated that none of this works. But how daft must a person be to fall for this? Do the victims actually think life is that easy? Don't they even pause for a moment and ponder that if this is all it takes to get out of debt, then why is anyone in debt? And talking about morals, I wonder how the scammers sleep at night after stealing the meager incomes of old, uninformed, superstitious, and simple-minded church ladies who often live in squalor while the scammer thrives in a lavish $1 million mansion. If these are the representatives of God, well, that's one hell of a God. Naturally, no one likes to be deceived, but some scams are so convincingly crafted that even the most skeptical of us are at risk. But most of them are not, and can be avoided by the application of elementary logic. The best advice is to be careful about whom to trust. It can never be said too often that if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. If you are someone who has been taken in by a swindler because you just didn't see it coming, this is the section for you. In his book The Demon-Hunted World, the late astronomer and thinker Carl Sagan presented the tools that help you counter nonsense. They are known as Sagan's Baloney Kit. Here they are paraphrased for space, but the interested viewer is encouraged to obtain this classic book for a better insight. When confronted with a claim you haven't heard before, ask yourself, how credible is the person making the claim? Is the person making the claim an expert in the field? Can the claim be explained in a simpler fashion? Is the claim falsifiable? Is there any experimental evidence that supports the claim? Has the claim been verified by truly impartial agencies? Is there scientific consensus the claim is true? Never, ever trust testimonials. We continued our search for the truth in this chapter. We identified many ways our minds may lead us astray and established a reliable method to help us search for it, the scientific method. We compared two dissimilar approaches, science and religion, and demonstrated these are hugely different thinking processes. In religion, assertions are believed in the absence of evidence. In science, assertions are believed because of evidence. Science is rational. Religion is irrational. Science rejects claims not supported by evidence. Religion rejects evidence that doesn't support its claims. Science abolishes absolutism. Religion is founded on it. Science is intellectually humble. Religion is intellectually arrogant. In science, emotion, anecdotes, and hearsay is irrelevant. In religion, they become evidence because nothing else is available. Science has a deep explanatory power. Religion has a very shallow one. Science provides compelling, coherent, and convincing answers to the mysteries of the universe. Religion provides simplistic, childish, and unacceptably limited answers to the same questions. This listing begs the question, since religions fall short in so many areas, what explains their popularity? The scope of the answer to this important question is too large to adequately explain here. In spite of everything that has been said so far, religion also has positive effects. Religion helps many people, both in the form of charities and as a psychological therapy. It fulfills many needs that are important to people by satisfying their sense of purpose, comfort, and meaning. It helps people maintain traditions, regardless of whether they are good or bad, as well as with association with social groups. Of course, these are all psychological needs that are easily satisfied by other means, although many people of faith choose not to explore them. Religion instills very unrealistic expectations of purpose and meaning. It convinces people they are far more important in the universe than they actually are. For instance, some people of faith actually believe the universe was created for them, and that people have dominion over all life on Earth, and thus can do whatever they want. But the evidence shows nothing is farther from the truth. Nobody is that important. Were it not for the mass psychosis that religion is, this narcissistic and self-absorbed view would be as laughable as it is pitiful. The verdict of science was rendered a long time ago. The evidence shows the universe was not created for us. We are the byproducts of the universe. Faith is purely a psychological phenomenon. It is not a fundamental need like eating, breathing, or procreating, but is better described as a pseudo-need instilled into children at a young age. If faith were a fundamental need, there would be no atheist. It seems that our brains are hardwired to be receptive to it, and it takes an effort of logic to get rid of it. Some people explain this hardwiring as an evolutionary legacy that gets beset by religion because of our ability to communicate. To help understand how this would come about, consider a tribe of primitive men some 100,000 years ago living in an arid area where food and water is scarce. Suppose some members of this tribe communicated with members of a neighboring tribe, who told them plenty of food could be found beyond this particular distant mountain range. There is no evidence to support that assertion. The information is hearsay and has to be taken on faith. And it turns out that some of the tribal members are genetically predisposed to believe this sort of information, while others are not. And because of that, the tribe is split into believers and skeptics. And the believers decide to take the long and dangerous walk to a promised land with their families. Their very survival renders the risk inferior. Upon finding more food, they would be far likelier to leave offspring than the skeptics they left behind. The genetic trait to be able to believe assertions without evidence would have presented them with an evolutionary advantage over the skeptics. Then eons pass and this genetic trait is transferred from generation to generation and is further reinforced by countless similar exchanges of information, driven by the scarcity of natural resources. And while really being the byproduct of survival, it just happens to be accommodating to other ideas that lack evidence. For instance, the belief in ghosts and goblins, and of course gods. But just as people are receptive to baseless ideas, an ability to separate good ideas from flawed ones has also evolved. This ability is logic. And logic demands physical observable evidence to accompany ideas. The absence of evidence helps people reject flawed ideas, even those that used to be dear to them, such as religious ideas. The modern person exposed to the logical flaws of religious thought often realizes that fear is widely used to coerce people to stay religious. The threat of gods and devils is used to control adults, like Santa and the boogeyman are used to control children. Once you realize there is absolutely no solid evidence for any of those ideas, you will realize there is nothing to fear. And only then are you freed from the shackles. With the information in the first and second chapter, we are now ready to begin exploring particular issues in which it can be said there appears to be a conflict between science and religion. The next video, Chapter 3, will investigate the so-called conflict between science and religion, and in it we will interview individuals who have a deep knowledge of this topic.